The Postal Service says it's close to running out of cash and may need to cut delivery days. USPS is asking lawmakers to step in and offer some assistance. Congress passed major postal reform legislation 4 years ago, but the mail agency is still seeing multi-billion-dollar annual net losses. Federal News Network's Jory Heckman is here with more details. Jory, thanks for joining me.
Hey, Terry.
How dire are the Postal Service's financials?
The Postal Service and Postmaster General David Steiner, they're telling lawmakers, they're telling members of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee that the agency is less than a year away from running out of cash. They've been posting multi-billion-dollar net losses in recent years, even after Congress stepped in and passed the Postal Service Reform Act back in 2022. That was a piece of legislation that wiped about $107 billion in liabilities off of the USPS's ledger. And despite that, they are still in these dire financial straits. And they say that there's some things that Congress can do that USPS can't do on its own that is really necessary to right the ship here. And Steiner told lawmakers that if the day comes that they run out of cash and they don't get assistance, they may need to make some difficult choices, including cutting delivery days or closing post offices.
If you want the same number of delivery days and post offices, we can do that, but someone has to pay for it.
Are there underlying structural issues here?
Yeah, the structural issue is really just a wholesale decline in mail volume for about the past 20 years or so. That mail volume peaked around 2006 or so, and then shortly around the 2008 recession, mail volume continued to go in free fall. That we are looking at about half the mail volume today that we saw back in 2006. And, you know, if you price that out to the current price of a stamp, which is 78 cents, this is a $81 billion loss in revenue that USPS is trying to make up for.
So what relief are they asking for from Congress?
They're asking for a number of things. Chief among them, USPS is asking Congress to increase its currently maxed out borrowing limit with the Treasury Department. That limit is currently capped at $15 billion. USPS says that there's really no other way it can borrow funds for its capital investments. It's trying to level up its delivery network across the country, and that they would need more borrowing authority to do that. They say that the $15 billion borrowing limit is outdated, and that if you adjust for inflation compared to back when that limit was set, that would be a limit of around $30, maybe $40 billion. So that's one thing they're asking about. Also, USPS is unique amongst agencies. They can only invest their pension funds, the retirement funds for employees, in low-risk, low-reward Treasury bonds. This is something that USPS says that's just not a financially viable thing for them to do going forward, and that had they had a different mix in investments, that they would be in a much different financial situation. And finally, USPS is asking for the Office of Personnel Management to take a closer look at its contributions to CSRS employees. Those employees are still around for USPS, and they say that ever since the 1970s, when USPS went from the U.S. Post Office to the U.S. Postal Service, they unfairly shouldered some of the burden for those CSRS employees, and they are asking OPM to sharpen their pencils and take a closer look at that.
What sort of reception did these requests get during the testimony and since?
Particularly from Republican lawmakers, you got a real sense of frustration that there was a real coming together back in 2022 to make this postal reform legislation a reality. This is something that Congress had kicked around for truly like a decade, and it was only up until 2022 that they were able to make that a reality. This was then former Postmaster General Louis DeJoy really working his contacts up on Capitol Hill, convincing Republican lawmakers that this was a necessary thing to do. And now, not even 5 years later, they're being told that they need more help from Congress. So that's a real point of frustration that USPS is, again, hat in hand asking for help, even though they've been on this 10-year reform plan, saying that they can do so much of this reform on their own, cut costs and generate more revenue. That just hasn't materialized yet.
And if they do have to set higher prices, you mentioned current first-class postage at 78 cents, how high might that go?
Steiner said that could be close to $1 if USPS had its way. There are, of course, some other forces at work here that the Postal Regulatory Commission, they have since stepped in and said that USPS between now and 2030, they will be limited to one price hike per calendar year. That ever since 2020, the USPS regulator gave the agency the authority to set twice a year mail rate increases, and they've been using that to great effect. Prices keep going up, and that typically happens every January and every July. And so under these new rules, the regulator says you have to pick one. You have to do one increase a year. The USPS has countered that and saying that they should actually have more authority to set higher prices, not just this more modest increase that they've been allowed to do.
Jory, in communities all across America, the Postal Service is the only mail delivery game in town. What happens if they don't get support from Congress? What are their options here?
Steiner does say that all things are on the table at this point, that they are hopefully trying to see if the Congress will be able to help them out here, offer some long-term financial relief. The Government Accountability Office also believes that this is something beyond USPS tackling on its own, that they do need help from Congress to handle what they deem as an unsustainable business model. But in the event that Congress says, no, actually, you're on your own, Steiner did say that there are options on the table to consider layoffs of employees. The labor costs are a substantial part of USPS's overhead, and also the idea of a hiring freeze. Steiner said that they'd have to be strategic about what that looks like. He says that you couldn't do a hiring freeze for letter carriers, for example, the frontline employees who are delivering that mail to 163 million addresses 6 days a week. But you'd have to maybe look at some of the mail processing side of things, the people who work in the post offices themselves, the postal clerks. It is a big workforce. It's a massive workforce of hundreds of thousands of employees. They'd have to find some place to limit hiring if that is what transpires.
What's the next signal we should be watching for and how this is going to play out?
Well, we'll certainly see whether lawmakers are on board with any kind of reform proposal or not. These things don't happen overnight, and USPS really is saying that this is a crisis situation. I will say the less than a year timeline assumes that USPS continues to pay all of its bills on time. Back in the peak pandemic times of 2020, USPS did kind of rely on some extraordinary measures. They didn't always pay all of their contributions to the retiree fund on time. They said that because of the acute financial situation, when they were going to run out of cash back then, that they were going to not pay some of their bills on time. So that is something that USPS may be able to do to buy themselves a little bit more time. But the real question is, as Steiner put it, what level of service the American public wants, and how do you expect to pay for it, and who is ultimately going to be paying for that? USPS, under its current model, they are more or less entirely self-funded. They are using the revenue from those stamps and from those packages to self-fund their operations. And so whether they need an injection of cash from Congress or not, that's also on the table. A lot of open questions that we don't have answers to just yet.
Thanks, Jory. That's Federal News Network's Jory Heckman.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find his story at federalnewsnetwork.com.